Welcome to Your Pathway to the Emirates, our new podcast channel. Here we will explore exciting real estate opportunities across Dubai, Abu Dhabi, and other Emirates in the UAE. Beyond property, we'll also delve into important topics to support anyone considering a move to the UAE, covering schools, tax, visas, company setup, relocation, and lifestyle. Our goal is to provide a comprehensive, one-stop guide that helps you navigate every step of relocation or investment in this dynamic region. Stay tuned for insights that will empower your journey. So let's get started. Welcome to our podcast, and today we have Manny again, and it's good to have you on board. And today we're going to be talking about the lettings process and the sort of, all the bits and pieces we need to know about lettings in Dubai, because it is different from other countries. So Manny, welcome.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So the lettings process, can you talk us through from the initial search to getting the keys? Let's start from the tenant's perspective, and then we can talk about the landlord side after that, because I think it's interesting to understand both sides, because you could either be someone who's buying a property and wants to invest, and then it's the lettings process you need to understand. And if you're going to Dubai for the first time, or you're not sure what you want or which area you're going to, or you've got a new job, lettings may be the best way forward before you start looking at a property. So please, let's start with the letting side. So what is the process?
Yeah, that was a bit of a broad question there, but I'm going to try to answer it the most concise way I can. So lettings process, obviously you come to Dubai, let's say you got a job here, you're moving over your business, whatever might be the case, I really actually recommend to rent for at least a year before deciding to buy. There is a few steps that you actually need to make before you can buy. So leasing really makes sense for the first year or first half year. The process itself is actually quite simple. People like to overcomplicate it. Obviously search, okay, where do we search? Well, for one, you can just reach out to me, or you just go online. We have two main portals in Dubai, three, Dubizzle, Bayut, and Property Finder. No one really uses Dubizzle. I would not recommend anyone using it. It's the same company as Bayut, but Bayut's a bit better. You go online, now they have super nice AI features where you could just type in what you're looking for, and it will give you a few recommendations. Those platforms are actually super useful. Be aware, though, that there is a lot of fake listings for brokers who are just trying to get the leads, basically, and then they will try to sell you whatever they have, even if it's not the same property that's advertised online. But once you find something that you actually like, obviously you contact the broker, you go on a viewing. If you actually like the property, you can put in an offer. What do we need to put in an offer? Well, essentially nothing, but nothing to put in an offer. If the offer gets accepted, you need to pay the landlord a 5 or 10% security deposit. 5% if it's unfurnished, 10% if the place is furnished. This money actually goes to the landlord, which you receive at the end of your tenancy if everything is in order. I think that's going to be another question where we can talk about this in a bit more detail. Once you pay that 5 or 10% security deposit, the contract gets drafted. Obviously, you go through the addendum, landlord and you both agree, you sign the contract. Then, depending on what you agreed with the landlord, you pay the first check slightly before the move-in date, because basically the landlord needs to receive that money for you to receive the documents that you need to register. Two things you need to register. You need to register the so-called Ajari, which is essentially you registering that, yes, I live in this property from this date to whatever is the end of the tenancy contract. And you need to turn on the DIWA, which is basically the electricity, water, gas, and everything else. So the house actually works quite well once you move in.
Yeah, that's quite interesting. So, but to do those documents, do you need an Emirates ID or do you need a residency? What is the sort of minimum requirement from the tenant?
Yes, so the tenant, to put in an offer, you don't need anything. To sign the contract, you do need an Emirates ID. Yes, very good question. You need an Emirates ID to register the Ajari. Actually, not even to sign the contract, but you are not going to be able to register the Ajari without a valid Emirates ID and a valid visa, of course.
Yeah, so obviously with the visa you get the ID and vice versa. So that's interesting. So obviously, and that's as a personal let, and the company let would be the same, I assume, because the company still has to show the person living there has got the Emirates ID and the visa.
Yes, there is one thing, and this is mostly for the landlords to be aware of. When a company is signing a lease, it's under the company's name, meaning So we usually recommend the lease to be under the tenant's name, not the company's name, even if the company is paying for it. Because if it's under the company's name, the landlord is essentially not guaranteed. So landlord doesn't know who's actually going to live there. So the company could say, oh no, it's going to be John and his family, but John and his family might move out after 5 months, and then the company could put someone else in. So from the landlord's perspective, it's a bit safer if it's under the tenant's name.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. So obviously, I think the check. I mean, what you've mentioned in terms of the contract and everything else is very similar to the UK. In the UK, we have a thing called a check-in report, which isn't required in the UK, and it's not required in Dubai either. However, it's probably something you'd recommend doing a check-in report, so the tenant can then say to the landlord, "This is a report I've done. Do you agree?" So when it comes to the checkout, which could be 6 months, could be 12 months, it could be 3-4 years, at least you have a record of any damages prior, so it won't be removed from your deposit in that situation. Is that what you think as well? Would you agree with that?
I agree with it. In theory, that's exactly how it's supposed to be done. In practice, though, the problem with Dubai real estate is, and especially lettings, is that a lot of people come here because they're sold a dream that, oh, come to Dubai real estate and you'll be a millionaire in a few years. Obviously, we know that's not the case most of the time. But a lot of agents leave very fast within the first year, or just move from lettings to sales and just stop caring about their previous clients. So while yes, in theory that would be how it should be done, but most agents don't do that because it's extra effort, it's some extra stuff to do when they in most of the time just care about their commission. They just care about, oh, let's just close this deal. I just get paid. I give you the keys, and I just stop caring, which is not
And we're
ideal at
and we're
all.
different, and we are different. So we would recommend accordingly. Then it's up to the tenant to decide, because there is an amount of money you have to pay for the type of service for the check-in reports, and then it's up to the tenant. But as long as we've advised, and I think that's the best we can do.
Exactly. Our job is to advise. Obviously, we are the ones who work in the industry who've seen quite a lot. we've seen probably everything that the tenants can imagine. The only thing that we're actually doing that's in the contract that can kind of protect the landlord and the tenant, but is obviously not as safe as this report would be, is to include it in the contract that at the start of the contract the house needs to be in perfect condition. Obviously, that's not bulletproof, and it
No, because
doesn't
there's going to,
always work.
yeah, there'll be some tiles that are cracked and things like that. You're going to get some notes and ningles. Really, furniture might be slightly marked, etc., etc. So I think a condition report helps, because that's how the courts work. They'll take a pragmatic approach and say, you've got a condition report, there's no objections, or there's an objection with this. It sort of helps, rather than just having a blanket statement to say these are all things that are damaged and we're just taking your whole deposits. And having a document always, I think, if it does go to court in that situation, it is always going to help. And I think the landlord is happier as well, to some respect, because it's an agreement. He knows what he left the apartment in, what state. So there's no going back on that either, if there's extra damage, for example.
Exactly. No, 100% completely agree on that. It's a really good service that I really advise people to do. Some people don't care. Obviously, it depends on where you're from. Most people in Europe are used to this. As you said, most people in the UK are used to this. Other parts of the world could be a bit more trust-based and they
Yeah.
just don't care. But still, it's something that we definitely recommend.
Great. So the next thing is, obviously, we talk about the payment options. Now, it used to be, and it still is, you can pay, a whole year in advance. You can pay half yearly or quarterly, but you can also pay monthly. But obviously, the more you pay, just like in the UK and most of the world, it looks more favourable to the landlord. There's no restrictions on the frequency of payment now, except for it has to be monthly, 6 monthly, or annual. But again, the more money you have, the more opportunity you have to secure that lettings, in my opinion. Is that what you think as well?
Yes, 100%. So this is quite unique in the world. In most countries, oh yeah, you're just paying monthly. In basically in all of the developed world, you're paying monthly. In Dubai, they still have this check system where it's like, oh, there are landlords who are telling us that, oh, I only want people who can pay with one check or two checks, meaning you're either going to pay the whole year upfront or pay two checks once every 6 months. To the European mind or to anyone else, it's a bit weird. Like how is that still the case in 2026? But it is sadly still the case, and landlords can demand whatever. It's the agent's job to actually negotiate that. most landlords are usually fine with quarterly payments, so 4 checks. But it's understandable that quite a few people just simply cannot afford to pay 4 checks.
The only unique thing about Dubai is you actually write physical checks, don't you? And you date them accordingly. Whereas, would it not be like a direct debit guarantee or a standing charge, which is what we have in the UK? But the paying process, is it a physical check, or can it be a direct debit or standing order type scenario?
It's almost always a physical check.
That's
There are
interesting.
some
Okay.
tenants who tell us, "Oh, please don't cash the check, and we'll just send the money," which they can do, yes, but the landlord is asking for the physical check as a security.
No, makes sense to me. And in terms of tenants' responsibilities, now I know that they have to pay the lettings fee. Is that correct? They pay
Yes,
that to the agent. So in the
exactly.
UK, it's not that way. The landlord has to pay. So that percentage is what typically,
It is. There is an industry standard which is 5% plus VAT.
and that we pay to you
Depends
as your fee.
exactly that you're paying to my company, basically to me as my fee. Most agencies charge this 5% plus VAT. There is one exception, which is again very common in the industry, that any property where the value of the contract is under 100,000, they are not charging 5%, but they are charging a flat 5,000 dirhams plus VAT. This
And
basically
okay,
makes it a bit more attractive for the agents to work on, let's say, studios, which would be, let's say, 60K to rent out, because otherwise, who would realistically work on a 60K studio if they would be getting only 3,000 from it, when they
okay,
could
and
just work on a townhouse community and make a lot more?
no, it makes sense. And also, obviously, these are fixed tenancy terms. So when it comes to renewal, do they have to pay the same percentage again, or how does it work for renewals?
Absolutely not. No, they do not have to pay anything. Most companies include it in the contract that in case the tenant wishes to renew the contract through that specific company and asks that company to draft the new contract, which is essentially just changing a few numbers, then they have to pay the company about 1,000 dirhams, which is usually just admin fee, and the agents don't touch that 1,000 dirhams.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay, so that's good to know because I don't think that's quite clear to a lot of people that talk about this. And in terms of tenants' responsibilities and damages and things like changing bulbs and decorations, what is their responsibility and what is the landlord's?
So how it works in Dubai, it's actually pretty standard and it's in all of the contracts. I'm not saying you can do anything you want with the house, because that's as long as you return it in the same condition when you leave, because that's not really the case. But regarding decorations, most of the time you really do what you want to do with it, as long as at the end of your tenancy it looks exactly the same as it looked when you actually got the house or apartment. Regarding the responsibilities in Dubai, there is a thing which protects the tenants a bit more than, for example, in Europe, which is the so-called maintenance fee. There is a threshold. For apartments, it's 500 dirhams. For townhouses and villas, it's about 1,000 dirhams. Meaning, if something goes wrong, something, I don't know, let's say the kitchen's on fire. Obviously, that's a bit of an exaggeration. But as long as the maintenance cost is under 1,000 dirhams or 500 dirhams, it's the tenant's responsibility. If it's more than that, is the landlord's responsibility to fix it. So the tenant essentially has a threshold of how much they can pay for some maintenance issues, which is pretty good.
That is, but that's per item. It can't be grouped together, so they can get away with saying, "Well, no, this tap, this sink, this works out to be above that threshold." It is per item, isn't it?
Exactly.
So that gives an understanding from the starting point as well what landlords and tenants are expected to do. Is there a time frame for which landlords have to fix things, or is it just quite flexible?
It is usually quite flexible, depends on the contract and how strict the tenant wants to be with the landlord. But generally, there is no time frame, as that could, if we go into this, okay, is there a time frame? Then that will give us a few questions that we need to answer. Like, okay, does the tenant have to give access to the landlord immediately? How do we prove that? So there is no real time frame.
Hmm. That does bring me on to access, actually. So, if a landlord wants access to do an inspection or to do some maintenance, does the tenant have to give that? And does the landlord just enter once that's been given? Or if they don't give authority to enter, are they still allowed to enter or not? Because it's a different rule in the UK.
So how it works in Dubai, and again, this is usually in the contracts. It's a very basic thing in the addendum that most decent companies add, is that in case of emergency or maintenance or repairs, the landlord has to give a 24-hour notice to the tenant, and then they can enter with just giving the notice, not receiving any authorization from the tenant, but just with the notice. Also,
Ah.
what we usually like to include is that when the tenant decides to leave the property, the tenant needs to allow for viewings as well, usually with a 48-hour or 24-hour notice.
In the UK, although it's in the contract to give 24 hours notice, we're still not allowed to enter without permission. We need a court order. So it does slow things down in some cases. So that's good to know. In terms of changing bulbs then and little bits here and there, is that a tenant's responsibility, the bulbs and smoke alarm, for example, batteries? I know I'm
Yes.
asking little things, but you know what? This
No, no,
it
no.
does
It
matter, I
does
think.
matter. It does
Yeah.
matter. As when the tenant is living there, it is the land. So it is the tenant's responsibility. But before the tenant moves in, the landlord has to make sure that everything works. So
Mm,
let's say the tenant moves in, they notice, oh, the smoke alarm is not working. Then, because it was in the contract that the house needs to be, like everything needs to be fixed before they move in, then that would be still the landlord's responsibility because that was
sure.
something that they didn't fix.
Now we come to a slight situation where the landlord wants to rent a property. I know for Airbnb, they have to apply for a certain license and they have to have certain things in place for an Airbnb rental to happen. Now, for a longer term rental, which is what we're talking about today, is there anything the landlord has to get before he can let out his property? Any certification, any safety certificates he needs, etc.?
Absolutely nothing. No.
Okay, so that's good for the landlord to know. Now brings us to the rent increases. So that changed recently. That I think, is it an annual rent increase is only allowed now? And that's based on a particular set of rules now, based on a certain website you can go to. Please, if you can explain some more about that.
Yes. So it's actually pretty important for both the landlords and the tenants. And most tenants don't ask these questions, maybe because they already know, but I seriously doubt that everyone is familiar with the so-called rental index calculator in Dubai. There is a public website that anyone can access where they can check. So how it works in Dubai is that, well, obviously the government, so RERA, the real estate regulatory agency, is comparing your building where you're living to every other building that is in your neighborhood, essentially. So if I live in a tower, then my rent will be based on every other rental in the same tower. If you live in a townhouse, then it's going to be based on that specific townhouse community, meaning the landlord cannot really increase the rent if your rent is still around or slightly above the community average.
And coming back to the tenants' payments, I mean, not only do they pay the rent, they have to pay for their own usage for electric, water, and gas,
Yes,
which is
exactly.
usually
So
which is usually metered, I assume. But for the service charges, which is communal area, communal swimming pool, and the concierge, etc., whatever the building has, that's still the landlord's responsibility.
exactly. So the landlord is paying for the service charges independently whether there is a tenant or whether he's using it or whether it's vacant. It's the landlord's responsibility. The tenant is only paying for the electricity, gas, whatever they are using, water in the house, but not the service charges.
Yeah, and that's what takes us on to this sort of when we talk about the landlord's yield. We're quite careful. I'm sure you are as well, because you wouldn't be working with us if you weren't. Is that we make sure that when we talk about yield to landlords, we explain to them there's a net and the gross. There's a gross and a net yield, and you've got to take into account the service charges and other expenses.
Exactly. No, it's very important to know as a landlord, as an investor, what the service charges are. Because, for example, especially with apartments, there are apartments where the service charge is around 10 to 13 dirham per square foot, while there are apartments where it's more than 20.
Yeah.
Obviously, your net and gross yield is going to be vastly different depending on which unit you're in.
So if a tenant is living in the property for X amount of years, and the damage he happens to do to a property is more than the deposit, what does the landlord do in those situations?
Good question.
Because here
Normally,
we have a thing called insurance. So I would have thought there would be landlord's rent insurance as well, possibly, or is it just not the same there?
It's not really the same. One, the landlord is hoping that it's not the case. Two, it's in the contract that the tenant needs to fix everything. Obviously, what if the tenant doesn't do it? Well, there is a lovely institute here called the Rental Dispute Center. A lot of landlords are visiting it, and a lot of tenants are visiting it. Probably a lot more than people think. But essentially, the Rental Dispute Center (RDC) is made for exactly these kind of disputes in Dubai. If the tenant is not paying, for example, because they were supposed to pay with 4 checks and the third check bounces, okay, what happens then? Can the landlord vacate the tenant?
Yeah,
Evict the
sure.
tenant? How does that work?
So the rent, not paying the rent and having damages above the deposit, same department, similar
Yes,
situation then. Okay. So what is the
yes,
process? The landlord would apply.
exactly. The landlord goes to the RDC, which is again the Rental Dispute Center, and they actually the RDC, as horrible it sounds that there is a rental dispute center, they are super nice and the operations are super fast. Support is better than Amazon support. Like they are fantastic. You go to them, you explain what the issue is, and they will know okay who to talk to, what to do. They guide you through the whole thing. Be that the tenant didn't pay, the landlord did something that they weren't supposed to do, anything. So they are actually quite helpful.
Okay. Is there an eviction process if someone doesn't leave the property? Is it a criminal offense? Or, I mean, in the past, long time ago, it was about, it was like about losing your visa and then being deported. But that rule's changed slightly now. So what is the current situation? What is the biggest risk to a landlord in terms of a tenant not? I'm sure it's not that big an issue there compared to what we have here. But just in
It's
case this rare occasion happens, what is the worst risk the landlord can face?
so basically how it works here is say your tenant didn't pay your rent. Obviously you're angry, you're trying to talk to them to pay the rent, they're not responding. That's probably the worst case that could happen. You go to the RDC, Rental Dispute Center, you raise a case, and the RDC will send them an official letter telling them to pay. They have 30 days to actually pay that amount. If they pay within those 30 days, they can stay in the property. You cannot do anything really against them. So realistically, worst case scenario, you just have to wait a bit more for your money. Or
Hmm.
if they say, oh, we're not gonna pay, then they will vacate the property, and the RDC, you will probably need to raise another case in the RDC. So it's really just about time, and then the RDC will make sure that you get reimbursed for your losses.
Okay. Have you ever had a situation like that, or you had a situation where the tenant doesn't leave?
I had a situation where the tenant couldn't pay, and he wasn't responsive. It actually happened around the start of the conflict. Tenant
Hmm.
was supposed to pay mid-February. He didn't. The landlord was like, "Well, what's happening? Please make the tenant pay." Tenant was like, "Oh, sorry, I was supposed to pay." Then the conflict happens. Tenant leaves the country, and then it was basically just chasing the tenant, trying to reach him. This is realistically the biggest risk that you face is what if the tenant leaves the country before paying, right? Because okay, what can the RDC do if the tenant goes back to, I don't know, Mallorca?
Yeah.
Nothing really. That case is a bit more complicated, and I'm wishing no one gets into that. But
Would
essentially, what the landlord can do, landlord still goes to RDC. RDC figures out, oh, the tenant's not in the country. Then they can essentially put the tenant's stuff out of his property if the
and
tenant is not cooperating.
is there a situation where they can put it onto their passport to say if they once they enter the country, there's a flag? Because it used to be, but I don't think that's possible anymore. I'm not sure.
I seriously doubt it.
Okay. Okay, that's fair in a way. I mean, you're going to lose a month worst case. That's for the small percentage that happens there compared to here. Where in the UK you could lose anything from 6 months to a year, maybe longer, going through the courts and the process it is here. So it's good to know. It's good for investors to know that there is a very small risk, and even when there is that risk, it's a very small amount. It's only 1 month compared to what you might lose here.
Yeah, exactly. Also, that's why a lot of landlords here are trying to screen the tenants. So for a lot of landlords, it matters. Okay, who is the tenant? Is it a family? Because realistically, if you are there with kids, you're not going to risk this whole situation to happen to your kids. So a lot of landlords are quite picky with what tenant they want. Also because it's very much based on trust.
And I do think that Dubai having their rules and regulations does bring in a nicer group of people, and people who
Oh,
aren't
100%.
don't want to follow those rules usually don't turn up in Dubai. Hopefully. So another question is, which we get here, is noise complaints. What happens if you as a tenant's causing the complaint and it's affecting another landlord's property, or vice versa? The neighbours are causing a nuisance. What do you do in those situations?
Call the police, which is a bit
Oh, really?
expensive, but
Okay.
call the police. Yes, you can very easily. So it's not like, oh, call the police to throw them in jail, but you can very easily, depending on where you live, but you can very easily call the police and just report a noise complaint, and then the
Okay,
police
that's good.
come and they will sort it out. So it's relatively simple.
Oh, that's easy. That's good to know.
My recommendation would be to tell them to listen, be quiet, because I'm going to call the police, because no one wants the police called on them.
Yeah,
This is
yeah,
the UAE. If you get the police calling you, you're in
it's bad
trouble.
news. Brings us on to the last thing is notice periods. What is the notice period a landlord has to give and a tenant has to give in case of vacating their property if they're vacating early, or they want to extend the contract, but just if things didn't work out as well as they thought they wanted it to, or in fact if the
Really good
landlord wants to
question.
sell the property.
Really good question. Let's start with the landlord, because that's a bit more straightforward. There is only 3 cases where the landlord can serve a notice. 3 cases if there is no. So obviously, if the tenant is in prison, that's a whole another story. But if everything is normal, there is only 3 cases when the landlord can give a notice. One, if the landlord decides to move in themselves. Two, if the landlord wants to do renovation, which affects the structure of the property. Three, if the landlord wants to sell the property. In all these cases, the landlord has to give a 12 months notice. From the tenant side, well, this obviously protects the tenant. But this is pretty good, because even if the landlord decides, oh, I want to sell my property and I don't want you to be in it, you still have a year to be there, which is pretty nice.
The landlord
Sorry.
could offer, I mean, just in case, let's say the landlord says, I want to sell my property, but rather than giving you 12 months notice, can I offer you something else? Or can I have the agent help find you a replacement? There's still that discussion that could be done, correct? It's just not enforceable.
Yes, exactly, 100%. And that
Okay.
we are having that discussion quite a lot of times.
Okay.
Obviously, we are there to try to help. Usually, if the landlord says, okay, listen, I'm going to give you some money back, just please leave a bit earlier, the tenant might be inclined to do that.
So it's good
Yes,
to have that talk as well. It's not just worth giving the 12 months notice if you want it earlier. It's worth having a discussion first, then putting the notice in.
definitely. Yeah. Answering the same question, there is 2 cases with the tenant. If the tenant wishes to leave the property early, let's say you signed a 2-year lease, which you can do, and you realize 6 months in that, oh, actually, I don't like the place, I want to leave, you have to give the landlord a 2 months notice and pay a penalty as well, which is pretty strict. The penalty is either 2 or 3 months, essentially depending on what the landlord says. But this 2 months notice and 2 or 3 months penalty is not something that the agents make up. It's not something that the landlord makes up. It's actual Dubai regulations.
And is there a website they can go to see those regulations, and also for the rent increase index? Where do they go?
Yeah. So for the rent increase index, you literally just type in Dubai rental index. That's it. Dubai rental index or Dubai rental increase index, and the first page that pops up, official site, you will see, and you can play with it. You can check it by area, how much your rent needs to be for the landlord to actually have the right to increase it, and or just ask an agent. That's the easiest way to do it. Just go to someone who works in real estate. Just tell them you're potentially looking to move. Can you please help me with it? And they'll do it in 5 minutes.
No, excellent. I mean, there's a lot of information you've given today, and I think it's been great. The thing I want to ask is there's a lot of agents in Dubai, and the reason they come to you or me is because there's certain regulations and qualifications people need before they can start doing what they do. In the UK, it's different to the UAE, but that's why we have to use qualified, certified people like yourself to assist our clients. So, can you tell me what is required from an agent's perspective for a tenant to check, or a prospective client to check that you have before they sort of enter into discussions with you or trust you?
Yeah, no, totally. So Dubai, before the conflict, officially we had about 40,000 agents. That is 40,000 licensed agents, meaning there was probably another 30,000 unlicensed, which is not ideal when you consider that the city has about 4 million people, and that meant that about 100,000 agents. That's just insane. Qualified agents all have a broker card. Ask them for their broker card. We need to have a license. We needed to do an exam when we started this whole journey. Similar in the US, a bit easier exam, but we need to do an exam to be a licensed broker. Try to work with companies, that's just my recommendation, which are big. You can do your research, which companies are big, because they are trustworthy, usually. Not necessarily big globally, but just big in Dubai, or some agents who've been there for some time. Or there is, social media is actually quite a good tool, because you can check, okay, if the agent is, I'm not saying the agents who are good will create content, they might not. But if they create some content and you can check who they are, obviously you can assess whether, okay, he's actually quite sound, I'm happy to work with him, or if that agent is just pitching properties and trying to sell you something. My recommendation is to go to companies which are either big or that you know, or obviously the easiest and the best choice is to come through me, because obviously while I have the network here to assist you in probably most of the cases. I'm not saying I'm the best agent for everyone, but I do listen, and I genuinely just want the best for all the clients.
No, I agree. Otherwise, we wouldn't be recommending you, Manny, for all of our lettings clients anyway. So, like I said, if you want to let something in Dubai because you're not sure where to buy, or you're not sure yet how long you want to stay in Dubai, etc., we're here not to try and sell you an off plan or a secondary. We're here to make sure that once you're ready, you come to us and then we find you the right place. So it could be the case that you need to explore Dubai first, in which case we'll pass you, Manny's details, and please, communicate with him and he'll help you. If it's the case you want us to help you with the off plan, and then you still need a lettings property there whilst the off plan is being built, that's another option Manny can help you with. Or if you just got a new job, etc., etc. There's many conditions. Please just feel free to talk to myself or Manny, and we'll help you through the whole process and guide you to what's right. Usually, if you're letting a place more than 2 to 3 years, the best option is an off plan, because of commercially, it works out better. There are secondary options as well, which we can help you with. So please do get in touch. So thank you, Manny, for that. It was very interesting. I think there's a lot of questions answered there. And if anyone has any questions, please, just comment and we'll try and answer those as well, either by writing back or a separate podcast if needed. I think we should do a separate podcast on the Airbnb side at one point. But it's been great. Thank you again, Manny, for your time.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to Your Pathway to the Emirates podcast. We believe that by staying connected with our podcast and social media channels, you will gain valuable knowledge and stay abreast of the latest developments that may be of interest to you, whether you are an investor, enthusiast, or professional in the industry. Do drop us an email on info@elevation88.com if you wish us to cover any particular topics. So please follow, subscribe, and stay tuned for our upcoming episodes and updates as we continue to bring you engaging and informative content.